Beveridge Report, which brought about the NHS and our social services and our welfare state in Britain, was probably the proximate cause of that was the speeches of Lord Haw Haw in the Second World War, critiquing the British Empire and the British government's attitudes to its own people. And so at first I was interested in that, which was a stunning revelation to me. And I was wondering how you got that notion and where it came from, because the idea that Nazism or a Naziist critique of British life could change and reform our polity is really quite astonishing.
Yes, it's a very important point. Of course, we can't prove that it influenced the Beveridge Report, but his broadcasts were getting about 70% of radio listeners at weekends. The BBC's rival offer, which was 5 hours of an organist called Sandy McPherson, was just not as exciting. But what Lord Haw Haw, William Joyce, was doing was a sustained critique of British society and its failure to self-reform after the First World War. He made great rhetorical perorations about heroes of Mons and Ypres who were left on the Dolcuan with inferior housing and so forth. So it was very powerful, it hit home, and the government got very worried. David Lloyd George, the former Prime Minister in the First World War, said everyone should listen carefully to what this man says. So people were running scared because these attacks resonated. Of course, they were selective, they were partisan, and of course, a lot of them were untrue, but there was a sufficient kernel of truth in them to make people discomforted.
So, the British Empire is making you die on the fields. They should provide you with the kind of care that citizens in Germany have. Yeah. And so on, and that's really fascinating.
Yeah.
But it brings us on to this notion, and I think you discuss it in your book, of differing levels of technology allowing for different kinds of propaganda and different kinds of sort of filtration of that into the public. So perhaps if you think of the 19th century village, the parish church, the priest, the lord of the manor. These are the influences of people who don't have access to literacy or the printing press. And then your great field of looking at 20th century propaganda with the advent of the radio. And I know you were talking about the radio transmitter as a means of, as we saw, one polity cross-fertilizing and bringing its ideas into another one, as we saw with this example. And then moving on to today with the rise of the internet, another level of technology, which then allows this democratization of propaganda. Where would you see the next stage? I mean, you mentioned, which I thought was quite intriguing, that it was Al Qaeda that first understood the potential of the internet, and ISIS then taking that forward.
Yes, well, of course, what you're doing is to relate propaganda to technology. This is crucial. If you look, and no one's ever made this point, the moment Hitler comes on the stage, late 20s and so forth, where he really, after the Wall Street collapse of 1929, he really gathers momentum. It coincides with a particular moment in technology. That is the universalization of radio, or at least the mass consumption of radio, and its evolution from the crystal set stage. It's also film technology makes great strides. You now have sound film, for example, in Germany from 1930. You actually can control the speeds of film so that it flows smoothly. There are great improvements in amplification in auditoriums, for example. So then we have the rise of colour, which the Nazis are very interested in. In other words, the rise of Hitler is inseparable. Even something like the aeroplane. He can visit 5 cities in a single day in his Hitler over Germany campaign. And the point is that all of these technologies coalesce in their evolution at exactly the same point in history, and that point is Adolf Hitler. Now, in the time since, again, technologically driven, Radio Moscow in the 20s was, I think, the first to be able to really hit a global audience, followed by all the transmitters the Nazis built at Season for the 1936 Berlin Olympics, where they could even hit India, and did. They had regular broadcasting. But today, what has fascinated me in simply doing reports for governments, the one on Al-Qaeda in 2009, the one on ISIS in 2017, was, in that short period of time, the difference in the technology. The Al-Qaeda films are quite clunky. You get them as DVDs, and you have to order them from a special source. It's all rather cloak and dagger. But when we come to ISIS, and I did my report for a certain spy agency, all I had to do was go online. There's no question of the dark web, something I wouldn't understand how to get into anyway. I just went online and I saw all these ISIS movies, a number were coming out every month. There was a vast amount of material. And so, not only the material, but for your responses. You saw these online clashes with people who hated Al-Qaeda and people who loved it. ISIS, rather, not Al-Qaeda. That became something of an anachronism. So this was the extraordinary thing. And the real evolution has been self-production. That has been the critical thing throughout history for thousands of years. Propaganda was essentially didactic. It was some kind of elite or cognitive group who are able to have a printing press and so on. Whereas today, it's someone in their bedroom. If you go back 12 years, if you go back to the US presidential 2008, you find a single American soldier making a critique of Obama, doing a YouTube video, and almost immediately he gets 11 million hits.
Yes.
Now, that's never been possible before in history. Private soldiers didn't defy their commanders through mass media. I mean, admittedly, Thersites rebelled against Achilles, but for a private soldier to do this has been unknown until the 21st century, and from that time on it's gathered momentum with the influencers and PewDiePie and so much more.
Yes. I noticed you were interested in the Swift boat campaign, which was so successful in the 2004 election.
Yeah.
And that struck me because it was, as you say, not entirely untrue or not plausibly true. And so it allowed that kernel of doubt to enter into people's understanding of Kerry.
That is the whole point. You see, it was an outrage. Kerry won his medals legitimately. He was a war hero. The trouble is he'd introduced ambivalence by also becoming an anti-war hero. And he could never quite reconcile those two features of his early career. Of course, his opponent, Bush, had never been in war. He'd been in the Texas Air Guard. And, of course, there'd been that famous missing year.
Yes.
We all wonder why. But the real point there is that the non-war participant beat the war participant by using this extraordinary mélange of fakery, doubt, and so forth. But the key is not to be believed, it's to cast doubt. And it successfully cast doubt on Kerry, working up the fault line in his record between being the war hero and the anti-war hero. That's how it worked. So the Swift it's given a new word to the American language, Swift boating.
Yes. I wanted to draw you on a notion you brought out in your speech, which was, it almost seemed that you were perhaps disappointed or concerned that people today didn't have a solid ground of what they conceive of as truth, and that propaganda, in its multifarious aspects and directions, seeds a kind of notion of doubt in the public. And you seem to think that was somehow maybe not ideal, whereas Socrates would say, the only thing I know is that I know nothing. We don't really know anything. We do go on testimony and to look at news, to look at politics, and so on. And so to always question the validity and honesty of those sources. Is that not a good thing?
Well, not really. I think that the problem is the chief interrogative mechanism, the press, has been dying on its feet for the past 20 years. And so what did exist, namely muckraking journalism, namely journalistic inquiry and so forth, has become, if not a dead letter, then a dying one. We've achieved a world not of credulity, but one where everything is believed and nothing is believed. In other words, we've become a world of credulous cynics. I think this is the whole point, that the civic character of social opinion is now one of doubt, and that affects everything. I mean, clearly people are getting away with making the most outrageous things, like that Churchill killed more people than Hitler, or that the Holocaust is a lie, and or that 9/11 was a conspiracy of the CIA or Mossad. You have all those things floating around. People are not believing them, of course, but they're not believing anything. They're thinking everything is a fabrication, like the moon landing. People think it happened, but there's always now a very slight note of queasiness creeping in. I should say, though, we've been here before. If we go back to the 1930s, we have a massive battle of the mind fought between the democracies, the fascists, and the communists, so much so that in America the propaganda analysis movement began, not only to fight fascist propaganda, but domestic fascists like Father Charles Coughlin, the infamous radio priest, but also corporate propaganda, which was leaking into American schools. And so we've been here before. The key really is to teach people about information, how to vet it, how to criticize it. The propaganda analysis movement had its 10 points of propaganda analysis, which taught you how to look for fallacies like glittering generalizations. And so in the end, the answer does lie in the education system. But we
critical
thinking. We occupy a particular moment in history when the technologies have evolved faster than the education and cognitive system has evolved to deal with this. There is this mismatch, and through that crack, we've all fallen.
In terms of the academic position of propaganda, I know that you've at some points been frustrated that something that is the key dynamic of human history has been shunted into business studies departments, has become a cadet field of marketing, has become about public relations, and kind of sidelined from its true heft and character. I know you're visiting now at the War Studies Department in King's, which is a better place for the study of propaganda. But how have you experienced that marginalisation of the field?
Well, at King's College, what we've done is launch a new Masters in Strategic Communication, which is garnering a huge amount of interest. And we have a centre for strategic communication. And we have connections with NATO, with the Cabinet Office, and so forth. So there is, at the official level, great interest. The problem is the academic level, because although I continuously assert that persuasion is the core dynamic of human history, that propaganda isn't just something, it's everything, nevertheless, the academy doesn't believe it. The reason for that is that propaganda doesn't fit into any single disciplinary framework. It is and it's not psychology. It is and it's not sociology. It is and it's not history. It is and it's not marketing. It is and it's not advertising. It is and it's not PR, and so on and so forth. But because it doesn't fit neatly into a disciplinary framework, but is spread out among all of them, academics won't touch it with a barge pole. Historians largely completely ignore it as a dynamic, for example, in the rise of Napoleon, partly because they don't have the concepts and tools of analysis. But it is actually very demoralizing that something which has come to define our era, if you take, for example, the Gerasimov doctrine of 2013, I think it was, General Gerasimov, chief of the Russian General Staff, created this idea of non-linear warfare, i.e. propaganda and disinformation, which the Russians have pursued ruthlessly since. Now, this is incredibly important, but the academy is not looking at it. or the troll farms or anything else, except in marginal ways and as part of other disciplinary discourses. It's not actually extracting it and analyzing it as a discipline in its own right, which it should be treated as. So the academy is helping and permitting this weed to flourish because it isn't developing the tools of analysis, it isn't doing the investigation, it isn't doing the exposure, because it doesn't fit into, in the end, an academic career structure. Studying this will get you nowhere. It won't get you one of those wonderfully high-paid chairs which some people seem to end up with in British universities. It's really outside the domain of academia, and that is a tragedy.
Yes. I see what you mean. Drawing further towards education, you think we may maybe live in an age of cynicism, but I was thinking, based on what you said about my generation, and I realised that we haven't rebelled. There's been no revolutionary impetus in my generation whatsoever. We've gone to school, we've got good grades, we've gone to university, we've tried to toe the line and jump through the hoops. We've then, in a down market, tried to get jobs whichever way we can from whomever will give them to us. And there's not been any solidarity in my generation or any rebellion, really. We've toed the line and sucked at the teat. The only rebellion you can really see in my generation is ISIS. That's the only place where people have done any thinking for themselves in terms of taking up a banner, and it's a nihilistic one for self-determination. But certainly, we live in an age where there's been no challenge to our elders, and no real generational thought. And have you seen that in academia? And does that contribute to this idea that people don't study persuasion and dissimulation?
I think the issue with your generation is this, that it lives and dies by the internet. It lives on the internet. The world of cyberspace is a world more real to it than the external world. They have in various ways rebelled. You had Occupy Wall Street, you have Extinction Rebellion, and so forth. You have things like Me Too, which...
Do you think that... actually, those kinds of small movements, as you say, they kind of prey on the credulity of my generation?
I think that is true, but the real problem is that they're all done at the cyber level, so you have no kind of personal physical involvement. This is what we see all the time. We certainly saw this with Occupy Wall Street and many other such movements, that they flare up, like the Gilets jaunes in France. They flare up and then they die down. They're like, peasant rebellions in the Middle Ages. The local lords would gang together and club them. I mean, it's the same kind of thing, because they're not actually creating a proselytizing organization.
Or even any infrastructure.
Indeed. As you look at something like the success of communism in the 20th century, why were the communists successful? Because they created an organization which you participated in, and with physical participation comes commitment. And this is the entire problem today, that these organizations are flaring up in cyberspace and they're dying down, but they're not leaving a legacy. Organizations which demand more of their adherents and physical participation, something like the Tea Party, are far, far more successful. For example, in 2012, there was a movement to catch Kony, the Ugandan warlord who was kidnapping children. And they created a video which got tens of millions of hits and so forth. They tried to create a number of
stencils for propaganda, stencils for graffiti. They distributed by the post and so on.
Things. And it disappeared overnight, having created a vast amount of public awareness. And that was only 8 years ago, but my students in class had never heard of it. The sort of pursuit of Joseph Kony. And this is the problem we face, that these things which are cyber-driven are having no long-term impact. And this is the crisis of your generation, there are various changes it needs to see. One is in housing. But they're not getting anywhere because they live in cyberland.
Yes.
And they've got to get out, they've got to physically participate and create bureaucratic structures, if you like.
Well, we could relate this to consumerism. I mean, when we began the blockchain revolution to bring Bitcoin and cryptocurrency to the world, we imagined that 16, 17, 18-year-olds would take up crypto wallets, start trading in crypto, start using cryptocurrencies to become cryptocurrency native by themselves. And so we thought, okay, well, we'll let a movement build. But in fact, we found that kids were using TikTok and Snapchat and Instagram and Facebook, consumer products on the internet. They weren't building anything for themselves on the internet. They were just allowing the adults to give them platforms and then playing around inside those sandboxes rather than creating any infrastructure for themselves. And you can see the same thing in the Occupy movements, as you mentioned. In Finsbury Square, for instance, they had an Occupy the City of London campaign, an encampment, a physical manifestation. But it was embarrassing. They were advocating anarchism. They were advocating self-organization. They were living or squatting in one of the most plumbed-in places on the planet. It's got water, it's got sewage, it's got electricity, it's got Bloomberg next door with feeds of data coming in and out of the building. And yet their encampment was a shit-stained wreck of tents, chaos, and dirt. And that was a terrible advertisement for the set of precepts which they were trying to advert to. I walked by there with a friend the last evening they were there, and they were having an argument. You could hear the shouting of their disputes in their supposedly democratic forum. And the place just stank of shit. And it was just such an embarrassment. I mean, I'm an advocate of direct democracy, but it was just absurd. And it needed to be swept aside and swept under the carpet as soon as possible. But no, I mean, we were shocked that young people didn't take up these new technologies for self-empowerment and for solidarity, but instead just stayed within the tram lines that they were given of Instagram and Facebook. Perhaps you could say that in Tony Blair's time, they needed to get out of the news cycle. You were talking about the lifetime of a lie, and actually the disproof could happen long after the spotlight has moved away and attention is no longer concentrated on what the lie was in the first place. But perhaps in Tony Blair and Alistair Campbell's time, it was the new daily news 24-hour news cycle. But today, as you say, it's just you've just got to continue until it slips off the news feed of one screen, and once there's something new that comes up, then it passes out of human knowledge, and people start to ignore those things. Do you see that?
Well, I mean, I think that the life of a lie is a fascinating topic, actually. You get, for example, in 1992, the Kuwaiti babies incubator story. The claim was that the invading Iraqi army pulled the plugs on Kuwaiti babies in incubators in a hospital, killed them. It never happened. It was an invention of the Washington public relations firm Hill & Knowlton. And the story was actually told, supposedly by an anonymous refugee. She was actually daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador to the United States. And George Bush Sr. Took up the lie and believed it and so forth, told it to the troops. When it was disproved, quite soon afterwards, time had moved on. Nobody was interested. And so it had done its duty. Nobody suffered from having told that lie. So lies become like disposable sanitary tissue. It's very frightening. Today, though, we live in a whole new world because it's characterized by two things, by intensity and multiplicity. So we're literally drowning in information, which makes telling lies all the more easy because the truth is never going to come out to hurt you. But it depends how you regard a lie. I mean, Goebbels would have regarded a lie as a deeper form of truth. So that when he said that the Nazis had sunk the British aircraft carrier HMS Ark Royal, which he did a number of times, they hadn't. But it really didn't matter because they did sink it. And saying that they'd sunk it was actually a declaration of intent, which our Admiralty were too naive to really understand. So it was an alternative truth because it became true. It was a lie which was going to mature into a truth once they'd sunk the aircraft carrier, which the bastards did.
No, so that notion of predictive truth is quite intriguing. I know you've before called propaganda a weapon of mass seduction, and that the correct metaphor is seduction and not coercion. That people co-create propaganda with the originators of it. Do you think we want to live in fantasy? Do you think we want to live in a world where we're given kind of more palatable lies than hard truths?
Well, that is where we do live. We live in a semi-fictive world. We always have beliefs about ourselves, about our nation, about our history, about our present. The trouble is we really don't want to be dispossessed of these untruths. This is a great problem, for example, with historians. History is the act of interrogating myths. And revisionist historians make an entire career from doing this, from proving that what we had believed is actually not true, by going to the original archives, by finding new sources which can always come on stream. I mean, there's recently a discovery of a poem by Sappho, the famous poetess of Lesbos. It was written about 2,300 millennia ago, 2,300 years ago. It has only now come to light because the patriarchy didn't want woman-on-woman love ever discussed. It was repressed. Now, something like that changes things, but it's suppressed information. So we have this all the time, new information coming forth from archives, from discoveries from archaeology. But we don't like this. In other words, it's discomforting to have these harder truths of our whole mythology actually put in the harsh light of day and shown that they are mythology. But it's an important point. For example, the Tonypandy massacre. The myth of the Tonypandy massacre was repeated by Jim Callaghan. I think when he was actually Prime Minister, the idea that the troops had gone into Tonypandy in about, a few years before the First World War, striking miners, that they'd shot them, killed them, and so forth. There was no such massacre in Tonypandy. There was, several years later, a serious incident of civil strife where some miners had been killed. Churchill did send the army into South Wales, but they never went into Tonypandy. They waited outside it. I believe one person was killed in a riot. That is it. It's all in Lord Jenkins, the son of miner Roy Jenkins's biography of fact of Churchill, and exposed. But it suited a lot of people to believe that there had been a massacre in Tonypandy. For all kinds of reasons, it was a convenient myth. And it's not very nice to have something like that exposed. And that is, of course, when the truth comes out, it's to Churchill's favour. But there are other myths of Churchill which are actually true, which we don't like to have the great man exposed. But there you go. This
He gassed the Kurds.
Well, Andrew Roberts claims it was tear gas. So who knows? The struggle goes on.
Yes.
The struggle over what is truth. I mean, one of the most poignant phrases in the Bible is actually Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor of Judea, to Jesus Christ when he says, "What is truth?" Well, that really nails it, doesn't it? What is truth? It's multi-layered.
Well, if we look at truth and language, and you mentioned historians and the ways in which they choose to interpret the sources they find, matching that with your notions about the credulity of the modern age, I think that actually features in the work of historians. So you can, as you know, you can as easily tell a lie as tell the truth. There's nothing sticky about truth to language. Any sentence could be a falsehood. It could be a lie, or it could be the truth.
Exactly.
And we don't know by the quality of that language, and we don't know by the number of people who believe it, and we don't know by any other factor, apart from corroboration by other sources, perhaps, is a relatively good marker of whether something is true or not. Whether that is true, or whether that sentence is true, and yet it almost seems that historians want to try and take a Rubik's cube of history and say, well, there's the pieces, the sides are incomplete, but if you solve the Rubik's cube, you'll solve history. Whereas if you take in propaganda, if you take in the lie, if you take in the notion that not everything that's said is true, it's almost as if, well, you've smashed the Rubik's Cube, you've taken half the pieces and thrown them away, and you've presented the historian with half of the pieces of the smashed Rubik's Cube. You say, okay, solve that. And of course, they can't solve it. But that's not as satisfying a story as being able to make history. And so would you see that there's a mismatch between the historian trying to make a history and the referent of those that signification, the events in the world that happened in the past? Is there a kind of bifurcation between the two?
Well, I think that what historians are doing is too often accepting words at their face value and documents at their face value. I don't think they appreciate nearly enough how far the craft of manipulation has always been a part of what people did and what people do. Medieval kings did it and so forth. The sheer wiliness of 19th century generals, for example. General fights a battle, but he also fights a public relations campaign. And we think that just because we had the PR industry arise in the later 20th century, I mean, Lord Mountbatten was the first military figure to appoint a PR man, Alan Campbell Johnson. But they'd always done it, and this is the extraordinary thing. And it is so easy. You see, events have open texture. There are very many different interpretations of them. And if you've ever actually been a politician, you can see the temptation to create reality and to synthesize it. I mean, I once stood for Parliament. One image appeared in the local paper of me making a declamatory speech with a loudhailer in the market square of that town. I never did. They took me there. They photographed me with a loudhailer. And the implication was there was a vast crowd listening intently. There wasn't. And this is the great temptation, to actually garnish reality with all kinds of untruths or semi-truths, so that what comes out is a vast bundle of meaning and impression, in which truth is located somewhere, but which has to be savagely interrogated by the historian. And I think that they're generally a little bit naive about the craft of manipulation, which has always persisted. Go back to the Romans, go back to the Greeks, go back to the Assyrians. It's always been there.
You have bottlenecks as well, where you have the opportunity to remake the story, to destroy the evidence, or to replace it with your own fictive evidence of, as you say, the deceit. And so these bottlenecks, wars, massacres, the change of dynasties, reformations, the Reformation is a very good example, give those in power, or those who survive, the opportunity to not only discredit the losing side, who are dead, and so can't speak for themselves anyway. And of course then the great temptation to do that, once you have vanquished your foe, to then tell a story where you're the good guys and they're the bad guys, and so you justify yourself retrospectively. But also to erase entirely the name of your foe, to pretend they didn't exist, or to take credit for their achievements, put your name on the things they did. And so I think those valencies, those kinds of relationships to truth, are things that historians really, I don't see factoring in to their analysis. Because you had these bottlenecks of everyone's dead and I survived, so I can then choose what the story is. So no, I think your field of study really speaks to that kind of analysis.
No, absolutely. You see, wars and revolutions are made through lies. They're made through propaganda. Truth bears very little part of it. If you take the American Revolution and the depiction of George III as a tyrant, which was fundamental to the revolution, and he's described as a tyrant, by the end of that process, the only taxation without representation, which is a brilliant phrase, the only tax which we're actually levelling on the American colonies was a tax on tea. And they didn't have to drink the bloody stuff. It was a purely symbolic tax. But nevertheless, the creation of George III as a tyrant was fundamental to the insemination of the revolution. And if you look at the Second World War, how did that begin? With the invasion of Poland? No. It began with dragging the bodies of concentration camp victims and putting them in German army uniforms, riddling them with bullets, and placing them around the radio station at Leischwitz, near the Polish border, and building this up into a Polish attack. I mean, as a classic false flag. Or something like the Reichstag fire. It's mysterious how the judge investigating it accused the Nazis of doing it, and he was, of course, murdered. In the late 1930s, I mean, time and time again, you see this. The Nazis, of course, were particularly distinguished exponents, but to a greater or less extent, everyone was doing it. For example, one British diplomat said that Napoleon had achieved more through his newspaper, The Monitor of Paris, than in all the achievements of his armies. In other words, you come to the conclusion in the end that war is a branch of the advertising industry, which is a very outrageous thing to say. It's also true.
No, I noticed in a lot of your writing you were discussing the propaganda of the deed and the notion of seeing your victory in war through the eyes of the media or through the eyes of its benefits to a narrative, as Goebbels would say, rather than its strategic utility. So I noted in your other book, Selling Hitler: Propaganda in the Nazi Brand, you mentioned that one of Hitler's key objectives in war strategy was revenge, but that doesn't have any military utility. It only has utility in branding, which I thought was hilarious and really very interesting. That revenge just doesn't have any function.
Well, the point is that Hitler was driven by propaganda values. He was the finest propagandist in history, the greatest master the craft has ever had, but it blinded him to other considerations. And to give you two examples, of course, the entire war hinged on Stalingrad, late 42, early 43. The entire war hinged on it. But why? Because he made it. Why? Because it had Stalin's name. There are other ways of dealing with Stalingrad. They could have gone round it, they could have bombed it. Why did they have the fight to the finish? And was the fight to the finish in the ruins of Stalingrad? It's almost unbelievable because of the resonance of the name. Or if you take the miracle weapons campaign of 1944-45, you have the V1, V2, and also the V3. You have this extraordinary assault on the British, 30,000 are killed in the V1 and V2 campaigns. They have no military value. They're purely weapons of civilian terror. And if you take a really great weapon, which had enormous military value, the first really combat-ready jet, the Me-262, what happened? Hitler insisted on it being made a bomber. Why? Because of the propaganda values of bombing, rather than a fighter jet. Now, what you have there was a classic case of authority leakage. The Air Ministry, the Air Force, refused to do this. And in the end, of course, because he was the Führer, he made them. with the slight concession that something like 1 in every 8 could be fighter planes. You see, the Third Reich was both made and unmade by propaganda values, because those were the values of its founding father, Adolf Hitler. Not merely an instrument of government, but the actual medium of government itself.
Yeah.
Everything was propaganda. There was an entire division of the Wehrmacht, the German army, entirely devoted to propaganda. And the problem is the legacy, because the imagery they created was so powerful, so dynamic, so resonant. It continues through time. We still see the Second World War through the prism of the Nazis, because they had the best cameramen, they had the best posters and so forth. That is because they made propaganda the defining feature of their war.
Well, we have here two great artists, Philip Firsov and Ed Mirza, who are enacting the kind of dissimulation that we're discussing, because, of course, these physical objects, as you say, rather than the cyber object of the interview, may last a lot longer,
yes,
and go a lot further.
Exactly.
But in terms of memorial and in terms of monuments, how is it that you how do you think that that events can be influenced in retrospect by the kind of objects they leave?
Yes, well, I think events have open texture. This is always the issue. We always assume with an event that it just has one supreme exclusive reading. It never does. The best example of that is actually Dunkirk. Dunkirk was a terrible defeat. Our army was surrounded on 3 sides. We managed to extract over 300,000 troops, but only because the Germans did not actually invade the Dunkirk pocket. They let us hang out to dry, but they let us out. So that was as much as a defeat, a national defeat, as any country had ever sustained in history. In other words, we were defeated by Germany in 1940, but we weren't. Why? Because Churchill was able, through his power of rhetoric, to actually turn defeat into victory. He turned it into a great myth of national renewal, the myth of the little boats, the drama of the rescue, the fact that the army, though it lost all its equipment, would fight another day. This is an extraordinary achievement, but it's a rhetorical and propaganda achievement. So, in other words, to impose a purely marginal reading on an event which had a dominant and indeed exclusive meaning, namely defeat, is a triumph of Churchill's leadership. But that is really the point, that any kind of event like a military defeat has open texture, and by the same token, a victory can be turned into defeat. If you take the Tet Offensive in the Vietnam War, which was a massive defeat for the North Vietnamese by the Americans, but the Vietnamese turned it into a victory by, for example, attacking the American embassy in Saigon, by creating these media artifacts which looked as if they're incredibly dynamic on the offensive and inflicting defeat. They weren't. They'd been defeated. But the media reading was of an American defeat when it had been an American victory. And this is why it's so important. And then again, to go back to your point, we read the past through its material artifacts like statues, and we actually read the past through its art, through its posters and so forth. But the meaning can change. In other words, you have to ask, why did the Bolsheviks retain Prince Trubetskoy's statue of, I think it was Alexander III? I'm not quite sure, yes. But it was extraordinary to retain a statue of a Tsar in Russia, but because it was such a menacing statue, it could be read, and maybe Trubetskoy intended that reading, as an indictment of Tsarism. It's such a frightening image of the ancien regime. The Bolsheviks wanted to conserve it because, you see, things can have a number of readings, and what we do is we impose a determinate reading through rhetoric, through propaganda.
We've seen that recently with the Social Justice Warrior campaign.
Yeah.
To get rid of statues, whether it's Rhodes in Oxford or roads which failed, roads in South Africa which succeeded, or fights in the American South over Civil War statuary. Why do you think it is that that in the West there's a sort of shrill movement to erase the past and its marks on the present?
Yes, this destatuization campaign, of course, goes way back in history. Countries, peoples have always done it because statues are very powerful markers of the past and what the values of the victorious side were. The real question is, how far does it go? There's a university in Africa, I think it's Zambia, which took down a statue of Gandhi, the Indian nationalist leader. In other words, none of the leaders of the past, no figure in history, can meet modern standards of political correctness. How can they? They rarely rise from the limitations of their own era. Afua Hirsch, for example, the Guardian journalist, demanded the removal of the statue of Lord Nelson because apparently Nelson had made pro-slavery remarks. They're actually, in a way, irrelevant because they're just things he obviously said when he was a young officer in the West Indies through the prison.
It's odd that she didn't say that he killed loads of Frenchmen. I mean, that would be an atrocity that you could put at his door.
Napoleon was attempting to conquer Europe and impose a French system of government. Britain stood against that. Now,
but commenting on his pro-slavery remarks,
yes,
rather than the people he killed,
yes,
when your values are presumably humanitarian and humanist, that's an oddity, isn't it?
Yeah,
to pick that node in the system.
His achievement at the Nile was really to prevent the French advance in the Middle East. He didn't actually kill all that many people because you can't if it's a ship. Rather than a land battle.
Yes.
But it alters the balance of power in Europe. So this is very fundamental. No, you get even all kinds of positive people, like Dr. Mary Stopes, and being exposed as a eugenicist. I think she was, I'm not sure. But they subscribed to ideas which were in the air at the time, like indeed eugenics, and are convicted through modern online courts of not being up to scratch, and therefore their memory must be erased publicly. This is a great error. I mean, clearly with the Civil War statues, there is an open issue because they were erected, most of them, in the Jim Crow era, and they're bought from the same manufacturers who made Union statues. In fact, the Union and Confederate statues are not separable. They look exactly the same because they're made by the same manufacturer and the uniform is the same, just a different color by and large. But the whole thing has grown now internationally. The whole world is catching on. The question is how far you take it. For example, there's a huge soldier, of a statue of a Soviet soldier in the middle of Berlin. Do you take that down or do you leave it there? I say you should leave it there. Whatever the memory of Soviet occupation and so forth, it is history. It is history, and I am of the view that this is an attempt to rewrite, to airbrush history, which is a form of censorship. These things are the legacy of history. By all means, contextualize them. I think it's very, very important that people should know the full story because there's usually a repressed side of the story. But don't exaggerate. In one online comment, I noticed it said that Cecil Rhodes killed millions. Well, actually, he didn't. He actually deceived King Longwella of the Matabele and got northern and southern Rhodesia by manipulation. He didn't actually conquer them with his private army, the British South Africa Police. There was later a Matabele revolt, but he certainly didn't kill millions. In fact, he didn't kill many people at all, except indirectly, insofar as he has some of the responsibility for the South African War. That was primarily a war between white people. So the whole thing is, history is infernally complex.
But we can see it happening live. The live streaming destatuization of people in the public eye today in the news cycle. Only yesterday, I think, one of Dominic Cummings' new advisors has resigned over politically incorrect speculations on blogs in the past. Is our society getting prissy about debate, about entering into debate, and about having had discussions in the past about politically incorrect topics?
Well, I think the problem is that young people have a huge presence on social media from their early teenage years. In this particular case, the things he said, which were outrageous, but he'd said them as a student. And this is the problem, that if you're part of that generation, there will be points where you've said outrageous or deplorable things, which can be excavated when you're offered a place in Downing Street in your mid-20s. And this is a very, very serious problem. That
Are we living in a Soviet-style censorship now, where
we
have to be the purest of the pure?
Well, I mean, unless what you offer, social media and so forth, is some kind of packaged bland food from the age of 14, when you will make the cut, or you're like, it's the cyber equivalent of Theresa May running through a field of wheat, then you're going to be in trouble, whether you're of the left or the right. You've said things at some stage during the thousands of words, tens of thousands of words you poured out over social media over many years from your youth. You can be convicted. And this is a very great problem, of course. People are being found out, the equivalent of discovering that Justin Trudeau apparently on many occasions wore blackface.